6 inches of water in my kitchen. My daughter's crib floated across the nursery. One woman's yard caused all of it. She smiled at me the next morning. I filed a complaint. 3 months later, the water came back worse. Then I found her secret. By the end, she begged me for mercy. My name is Maya Chen, and before all this, I was just a mother trying to keep her family's life ordinary in Willowbrook Estates, North Carolina. My husband Daniel worked long hours at his firm. Our daughter Lily was 2, and our biggest worry used to be paint colors, not property lines. We'd bought our house because of the yard, flat, green, perfect for a swing set. Our next-door neighbor was Deborah Voss, HOA president for 11 years running. A woman everyone described the same way. Sweet until you cross her. I didn't understand what that meant yet. Deborah's house sat slightly uphill from ours. A fact I hadn't thought twice about until the spring she hired a landscaping crew to improve drainage around her new pool cabana. Trucks came for a week. Nobody from the HOA board mentioned it to the rest of us, which struck me as odd. I noticed the change first in small ways. A soggier patch near our fence, grass that stayed damp 2 days after rain instead of 1. I mentioned it to Daniel, who shrugged it off as normal spring runoff. I wanted to believe him. Deborah started popping by more often that season, always with a compliment and a complaint stitched together. Your mailbox is darling, though HOA guidelines do specify approved colors only. She had a way of smiling while drawing a line in the sand. At the community potluck, I overheard 2 neighbors trade a knowing look when Deborah's name came up. Ask the Hendersons what happened to their fence, one muttered. I filed that away without understanding its weight. By early June, our backyard held standing water after every storm, water that had never pooled there in the 2 years we'd lived in the house. I started taking photos on my phone, not from suspicion yet, just from mild annoyance. Daniel finally noticed too, coming home to find our patio furniture legs sunk an inch into mud. This isn't just rain, he said, frowning at the yard. I told him I'd bring it up with Deborah, since she was, after all, the HOA president. I texted her something simple and friendly. Hey Deborah, have you noticed more water pooling near the property line lately? Just curious if it's a shared issue. She left me on read for 2 days, which should have told me something. When she finally replied, it wasn't an answer. It was an HOA notice, official letterhead and all, informing us that our lawn's unkempt drainage grading violated community aesthetic standards and needed correcting within 30 days. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. I laughed out loud. Actually laughed, because the accusation was so backwards it felt like a joke. Our yard had been fine for 2 years. The only thing that changed was her landscaping project uphill from us. Daniel wanted to march over immediately. I asked him to let me handle it diplomatically first. I still believed, foolishly, that this was a misunderstanding between reasonable adults. I invited Deborah for coffee, hoping a face-to-face chat would clear things up. She arrived in tennis whites, sunglasses pushed onto her head, and sat at my kitchen table like she was doing me a favor by showing up at all. Your grading is off, Maya. Water needs somewhere to go. She said it flatly, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. I asked, gently, whether her new landscaping might have redirected the flow toward us instead. She waved a hand. My yard was engineered. Engineered by who? I asked. My cousin's company, she said. Too quickly, like she hadn't meant to share that detail. She caught herself and added, a licensed contractor. Obviously. I noted the slip but let it go, still hoping to keep peace with my neighbor. She left without agreeing to anything, but not before glancing at our fence line and saying, you'll want to fix that grading before the HOA has to get involved further. It sounded less like advice and more like a warning wrapped in politeness. That night, I searched the county property records for the first time, just curious about elevation and easements. I found nothing unusual, no recorded drainage agreement between our lots. Whatever Deborah was doing, it wasn't documented anywhere official. I didn't know yet how much that detail would matter. The 30-day deadline came and went. I sent Deborah photos proving our yard was properly graded, unchanged since our home inspection. Her response was a second notice, this one with a $250 fine attached for failure to remediate. Daniel was furious. She created, he said, pacing our kitchen. I called the HOA's management company directly, hoping someone above Deborah could offer perspective. The woman on the phone side, MS, all drainage disputes personally. I requested an official inspection from the county stormwater office instead of relying on Deborah's word. The earliest appointment was 6 weeks out. 6 weeks of more rain, more mud, more soggy grass creeping toward our back porch. In the meantime, Deborah began greeting me with tight, performative smiles at the mailbox, the kind that said she knew exactly what she was doing. Still working on that grading? She'd ask, sipping her iced coffee, watching my daughter's swing set sink slightly into wet earth. I tried appealing the fine through the HOA's formal process, submitting my own photos and a written timeline. The appeal went to a 3-person committee. 2 of the 3 members, I later learned, were close friends of Deborah's from her book club. The appeal was denied in 4 days, faster than any HOA process I'd seen before or since. The letter cited insufficient evidence of external causation, language that felt lifted directly from Deborah's own vocabulary. Frustrated, I started talking to other neighbors, testing the waters carefully. An older man named Mr. Alvarez, 2 houses down, finally opened up. She did something like this to the Hendersons 2 years ago. They moved before anyone figured out what was going on. What happened to them? I asked. He shrugged. Notices. A lot of stress. Then one day their house had a for sale sign. Nobody really talks about it. A small chill ran through me. This wasn't new behavior. It was a pattern. I started keeping a folder, digital and physical, documenting every notice, every fine, every photo of standing water. Daniel thought I was being obsessive. I told him I'd rather have too much evidence than not enough. Though I still didn't know what I'd need it for, the county stormwater inspector finally came in late July. He walked our property, then Deborah's, taking measurements with a laser level. He was quiet, professional, gave nothing away, but I saw him pause a long time at the base of Deborah's new French drain system. I'll have a report in 2 to 3 weeks, he said before leaving. Deborah appeared on her porch just as his truck pulled away, waving cheerfully like she hadn't just spent 20 minutes explaining to him, loudly, how engineered her landscaping was. 2 weeks later, a storm dumped 3 inches of rain overnight. I woke to find our entire back lawn submerged, water lapping at the bottom step of our porch. Lily's sandbox had floated 6 feet from where it usually sat. I called Deborah first, foolishly hoping she'd finally acknowledge the obvious. She answered on the second ring, voice bright. "Oh no! Is your yard flooding again? Have you considered French drains?" "Mine work beautifully." The dismissiveness in her tone told me everything. I photographed the flooding from every angle, timestamps visible, before the water even receded. I sent copies to the county inspector, to the HOA management company, and to myself. 3 separate email accounts, just in case anything ever conveniently disappeared. That evening, Daniel found me sitting on the porch steps, staring at our ruined lawn. "We need to talk to a lawyer," he said quietly. I nodded. It's 2 months. This had stopped being a neighbor dispute and become something else entirely. We consulted a real estate attorney the following week. She reviewed our documentation and grew visibly interested. "This pattern, fines issued right after you complain, appeals denied by conflicted committee members. This isn't just poor drainage. This could be actionable harassment. Keep documenting everything," the attorney told us. "Don't confront her directly anymore. Let the paper trail speak." I left her office with something I hadn't felt in weeks. A plan, however small, instead of just dread. The county's stormwater report arrived in mid-August, and it wasn't ambiguous. The inspector documented that Deborah's regrading had raised her lot's elevation near the shared property line by nearly 8 inches, funneling runoff directly toward our house. It recommended she correct the grading within 60 days. I felt something like vindication for the first time since this started. I forwarded the report to the HOA board and to Deborah herself, expecting an apology, or at least a quiet correction. Instead, I got silence for 4 full days. When Deborah finally responded, it was to announce, at the next HOA meeting, that she was disputing the county's findings and hiring her own private engineer to conduct a second opinion. She said this while looking directly at me across the room. The private engineer, unsurprisingly, worked for the same firm as her cousin's construction company. His report, released 2 weeks later, concluded the drainage issue was inconclusive and recommended further study, a convenient way to stall without ever admitting fault. Meanwhile, my fines kept accumulating. 250 became 500. The HOA attached a lien notice to our account, threatening to place a formal lien on our home if the balance went unpaid, an escalation that felt wildly disproportionate to a landscaping disagreement. Daniel wanted to pay it just to make the problem disappear. I refused. "Once," I told him. "She wants us tired enough to give up." Our attorney agreed, advising us to pay under written protest instead, preserving our right to dispute it later. Deborah escalated in smaller, meaner ways too. Our HOA newsletter that month featured a community spotlight on lawn care best practices, illustrated, unmistakably, with a photo of our flooded backyard. Our address blurred, but our fence clearly visible. Neighbors started looking at us differently at the community pool, whispering behind sunglasses. Someone had clearly been telling a version of our story that painted us as negligent homeowners rather than victims of bad drainage engineering. I confronted Deborah about the newsletter photo directly, unable to hold back this time. That's an invasion of privacy, I said. She feigned innocence beautifully. I had no idea that was your yard. The photo was submitted anonymously. I didn't believe her for a second. Our attorney sent a formal cease and desist letter regarding the newsletter and the ongoing fines. Deborah's response came through the HOA's own counsel, a friend of her husband's. We later discovered, denying any wrongdoing and threatening a countersuit for defamation. The stress started showing in ways I hated. I snapped at Daniel over nothing. I lost sleep replaying every interaction with Deborah, searching for what I could have done differently, even though logically I knew this wasn't my fault. Lily started asking why the water lady made Mommy sad. I hadn't realized how much she'd absorbed from overheard phone calls and my tired sighs. That broke something in me. This had stopped being about property lines and started being about protecting my daughter's sense of home. I began attending every HOA meeting, sitting in the front row, taking careful notes. Deborah always ran the meetings with practiced efficiency, cutting off anyone who lingered too long on drainage complaints, redirecting to new business with a smile that never reached her eyes. At one meeting, an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Okafor raised her hand and mentioned she'd noticed similar pooling near her own property since Deborah's landscaping went in. Deborah shut the comment down fast. That's an unrelated topic, Mrs. Okafor. Let's stay on agenda. I started talking to Mrs. Okafor after meetings, in the parking lot, away from Deborah's earshot. She confirmed what Mr. Alvarez had told me. The Hendersons weren't the only family Deborah had pushed out. There'd been at least one more, years earlier, before I'd moved in. Why doesn't anyone report her to the state? I asked. Mrs. Without humor. Report her for what? Everything looks official. That's what makes her dangerous. She knows exactly how far the rules bend before they break. September brought another storm. Smaller this time, but our yard flooded anyway, faster and deeper than it should have for the rainfall amount. I started to suspect Deborah wasn't just neglecting the problem. She might be actively making it worse. I set up a cheap trail camera facing our shared fence line. Technically legal since it only captured our own property and the visible portion of hers from a public angle. I told myself it was just for documentation. Some part of me suspected I'd find more. 3 days later, the camera caught something I hadn't expected. A landscaping crew, arriving after dark, working by headlamp along Deborah's property line. That wasn't normal daytime maintenance. That was something being done deliberately, quietly, and out of sight. I couldn't make out details in the grainy night footage, just shapes and the glint of shovels. But the timestamp was undeniable. 10:47 p.m. A full crew job happening in near total darkness on a residential street with an HOA noise ordinance Deborah herself had written. The next morning, our yard was wetter than it had been in weeks, despite no rain overnight. I photographed it immediately, cross-referencing the footage timestamp with the sudden change. My attorney later called this a smoking gun, if we can prove intent. I reported the nighttime work to the county. Technically a noise ordinance and possibly a permit violation. An officer came out, found no crew present by then, and could only issue a warning based on secondhand reports, since my footage didn't clearly show county code violations. Deborah found out about the report within hours. The county officer had mentioned it to the HOA management company, who reported directly to her. She showed up at my door that evening, all pretense of friendliness gone. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Excuse me," I replied, genuinely startled by her tone. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she continued, voice low and controlled. "I've been running this community for 11 years. People who fight me don't win. Ask around." Then she turned and walked back to her house. I stood on my porch for a long moment after she left, hands shaking slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the sheer audacity of the threat. Daniel came outside and found me there. "What did she say?" I told him everything. "That's it," Daniel said. "We're recording every interaction from now on. And I'm calling the attorney first thing tomorrow." For the first time, I saw real anger in him. Not just frustration, the protective kind that comes when someone threatens your family. Our attorney was unusually serious on the call. "A direct verbal threat, documented and witnessed, changes things," she said. "This is no longer just a property dispute. Document it in writing tonight while it's fresh. And let's discuss a restraining order if this continues." I wrote down Deborah's exact words that night, word for word, my hands still slightly unsteady. Reading it back, I realized how calculated her threat had been, vague enough to deny, specific enough to terrify. She'd clearly done this before. The following week, the HOA sent a new notice. Our fines had been referred to a collections agency due to non-payment, despite our attorney having sent proof of payment under protest weeks earlier. Felt less like an accounting error and more like retaliation. I called the collections agency directly, spent 90 minutes on hold, and eventually got confirmation that the payment had, in fact, been received and processed by the HOA, meaning someone had deliberately reported us as delinquent anyway. That someone had access to those records. Our attorney flagged this immediately. Fraudulent collections reporting isn't just petty, it's potentially illegal, and it damages your credit. This is escalating in a way that could work in our favor legally. Keep every document. I started to feel, for the first time, that we might actually win. I requested a copy of the HOA's full financial records as a homeowner, a right technically guaranteed in our bylaws. Deborah, as president, was required to provide them within 30 days. She stalled, citing administrative delays, for nearly 2 months instead. When the records finally arrived, they were incomplete, missing entire quarters of expense reports, particularly around the time of Deborah's own landscaping project. I noted the gap and mentioned it to Daniel. "That's not an accident," he said. "That's a cover-up." I brought the incomplete records to our attorney, who suggested a formal records demand letter citing the specific bylaw violated. "If she stalls again after this, it strengthens a breach of fiduciary duty claim," she explained. I hadn't even considered Deborah might be mismanaging HOA money, not just our drainage. Around this time, Mr. Alvarez quietly slipped a folder into our mailbox. No note attached. Inside were old HOA newsletters from the year the Hendersons left, along with a handwritten timeline he'd apparently kept himself, tracking Deborah's pattern of fines against neighbors who'd crossed her. His notes revealed something chilling. Every family who'd left the neighborhood under pressure from Deborah had done so within 18 months of a landscaping project she'd personally overseen. The pattern wasn't a coincidence. It was a method. I started to wonder what exactly Deborah's landscaping projects were actually for: drainage control, sure, but also, perhaps, deliberately raising her own property's value while devaluing and destabilizing the homes around her. One flooded yard at a time. Daniel and I stayed up late that night, spreading Mr. Alvarez's timeline across our kitchen table alongside our own folder. 2 years of evidence from 2 different families started forming a picture far bigger and darker than a single flooded backyard. "We can't just fight this for us," I said to Daniel. "If this pattern is real, she's done this to other families and she'll do it again." He nodded slowly. "Then we build a case that doesn't just protect us. It exposes her." That decision changed everything about how I approached the fight from that point forward. This was no longer just about drying out our lawn. It was about finally holding Deborah Voss accountable for something she'd clearly gotten away with for years. Strangely, October brought a lull. The fines stopped. Deborah even waved pleasantly at the mailbox one morning, as if the past several months had simply evaporated. I didn't trust it for a second, but the quiet was, admittedly, a relief. Daniel wanted to believe she'd backed off after realizing we had an attorney involved. I wasn't so sure, I said. They regroup. Still, I let myself enjoy a few weeks of normalcy, taking Lily to the park without checking my phone every 10 minutes. Our attorney used the quiet period productively, filing formal records requests with the county and quietly reaching out to the Hendersons, who'd left 2 years earlier, to see if they'd be willing to share their own documentation of Deborah's behavior. The Hendersons responded within days, clearly still carrying resentment. They sent over an entire archive, photos, fine notices, even an audio recording of a heated HOA meeting where Deborah had accused Mr. Henderson of orchestrating a smear campaign against her. Listening to that recording sent chills through me. Deborah's voice on it sounded eerily identical to the tone she'd used on my porch. Calm, controlled, threatening without ever saying anything explicitly actionable. This wasn't improvisation. This was a script she'd used before. The Hendersons also mentioned something new, shortly before they left. A mysterious inspection had flagged their home for structural drainage damage that later turned out to be fabricated, tanking their resale value until they fought it and got the inspection overturned. "She wanted us gone cheap, Mrs. Henderson wrote in her email. "We finally just took the loss and left. Please don't let her do that to you." Reading those words, I felt a fresh wave of resolve mixed with anger on behalf of a family I'd never even met. I started cross-referencing the Hendersons' fabricated inspection with the name of the inspector who'd filed it. It matched a name I'd seen before, buried in the incomplete HOA financial records. A consulting fee paid out the same month, to the same individual. I brought this to our attorney immediately. She went quiet on the phone for a moment. "If Deborah paid a private inspector to falsify findings and funneled that payment through HOA funds," she said slowly, "that's not just harassment anymore. That's fraud." The word landed heavy in my chest. Fraud wasn't something I'd expected to be dealing with when this started over a wet lawn. But every new piece of evidence made clear that Deborah's control over this neighborhood ran far deeper than pettiness. Meanwhile, our own drainage situation hadn't improved, quiet period or not. The ground stayed saturated, and I noticed our foundation had developed a hairline crack near the back corner, right where the water pooled deepest. A contractor confirmed it was water-related. That crack terrified me more than any fine ever had. Fines could be disputed. Structural damage to our home was permanent, expensive, and directly tied to Deborah's regrading, whether she wanted to admit it or not. The stakes had quietly become existential. I photographed the crack extensively and had it professionally documented by a structural engineer, adding another undeniable piece to our growing case file. Daniel started calling it the war chest, half joking, though neither of us felt much like laughing anymore. By early November, our attorney told us she felt ready to escalate formally. A demand letter outlining damages, the fabricated inspection, the fraudulent collections report, and a request for mediation before pursuing litigation. This should get her attention, she said. It did, though not in the way we expected. The demand letter went out on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Deborah had called an emergency HOA board meeting, closed to general homeowners, to discuss urgent community legal matters. I only found out about it because Mrs. Okafor texted me a photo of the posted notice. That same week, a new sign appeared at the neighborhood entrance, an anonymous community concern flyer accusing an unnamed family of harassing longtime residents and spreading false accusations to avoid HOA responsibilities. Everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly who it meant. I felt sick reading it, standing at the mailbox with Lily on my hip. Neighbors who'd been polite but distant now actively avoided eye contact. Deborah had turned public opinion against us before we'd even filed a single formal complaint outside the community. Daniel wanted to take the flyer down immediately. Our attorney advised against it. Photograph it. Don't touch it. This is evidence of a coordinated smear campaign, and removing it could complicate that. Everything now felt like a chess move, calculated 3 steps ahead. The emergency board meeting results leaked a few days later. Secondhand, from a sympathetic board member who'd grown uneasy with Deborah's tactics. Apparently, Deborah had proposed using HOA reserve funds to hire a defense attorney in anticipation of frivolous litigation. Using shared community funds, money meant for pool maintenance and street repairs, to defend herself against a dispute she'd personally created struck me as almost impressively brazen. I mentioned it to our attorney, who noted it down without much surprise. Consistent with the pattern, she said. Around this time, our trail camera caught something else unexpected. Deborah herself, alone at dusk, standing at the property line with what looked like a small handheld device, moving it slowly along the fence. I couldn't identify it clearly, but it wasn't a garden tool. I zoomed and enhanced the footage as best I could on my laptop. It looked like she might be taking soil or moisture readings, which struck me as strange behavior for someone who insisted publicly that no drainage problem existed on her property at all. 2 nights later, the same crew from before returned after dark again, this time working for nearly 3 hours. My camera's memory card filled up before they finished. Whatever they were doing, Deborah clearly wanted it done without daylight witnesses or county inspectors watching. The next morning, I discovered a new drainage pipe extension had been added along Deborah's fence line, angled unmistakably to direct additional flow even more directly toward our property. It wasn't subtle. Like she no longer cared if we noticed. I photographed the new pipe from every angle before the sun had fully risen, terrified she'd have it removed by afternoon. Sure enough, by that evening, it was gone. The ground disturbed and hastily patched, as if it had never existed at all. Thankfully, My photos had timestamps and GPS metadata intact. I sent them to the county stormwater office immediately, referencing the original inspection report from months earlier. The inspector called back within a day, his tone notably more urgent than before. "This looks like a deliberate violation of the corrective order we issued," he said. "I'm going to schedule a follow-up inspection with less notice this time." I felt something shift. For the first time, the county seemed genuinely alarmed rather than just procedurally polite. Deborah, unaware the pipe had been photographed, continued acting as though nothing had happened, greeting neighbors at the community Thanksgiving potluck with her usual polished warmth. Watching her charm a crowd who just read an anonymous flyer smearing my family made my stomach turn. At the potluck, she approached our table directly, smiling for the benefit of onlookers. "I do hope we can put all this unpleasantness behind us soon, Maya. It's not good for the community." I smiled back, just as tightly. "I completely agree, Deborah." Daniel squeezed my hand under the table, a silent reminder to stay composed. We'd learned by then that any visible reaction from us became ammunition in Deborah's version of events, retold later to sympathetic neighbors as evidence of our instability. The follow-up county inspection happened 4 days later, unannounced, exactly as promised. The inspector found clear evidence of recent excavation and a hastily buried but still partially intact drainage extension. Physical proof matching my photographs almost exactly. This time, the county didn't just issue a warning. They issued a formal violation notice with a firm compliance deadline and, notably, referenced a pattern of non-compliance with a prior corrective order, language that would matter enormously later. Deborah's response was immediate and aggressive. She filed an appeal with the county, claiming the pipe had been installed by a rogue contractor without her knowledge or authorization, the same defense, I realized, she'd likely used against the Hendersons years earlier. Except this time, the county already had my nighttime camera footage showing her standing at the exact location, device in hand, the same week the pipe appeared. Our attorney submitted it as supporting evidence to the county's compliance division without hesitation. The appeal hearing was scheduled for early December. Our attorney told us our presence wasn't required but recommended it anyway. "Sometimes seeing the people you've harmed sitting in the room changes how a case unfolds," she said. I decided to be there. In the days before the hearing, Deborah's behavior grew noticeably erratic. She stopped attending the community gym at her usual time. Her husband, rarely seen before, started appearing at HOA events, tight-lipped and watchful, clearly aware something significant was unfolding. Mrs. Overhearing Deborah on the phone near the mailboxes, voice raised, saying something about the cousin's paperwork needing to check out clean. I didn't know what that meant yet, but it sounded like exactly the kind of thread worth pulling. I mentioned the overheard call to our attorney, who connected it immediately to the earlier engineering claim Deborah had made about her cousin's construction company. "If that paperwork isn't legitimate," she said, "we might be looking at more than a civil drainage dispute." She requested official licensing records for the cousin's company through the state contractor board. Took 2 weeks to come back, but when it did, the answer was clear and damning. The company had never actually been licensed in North Carolina at all. Every engineering approval Deborah had cited for over a year, the original landscaping, the disputed second opinion contradicting the county's report, had come from an unlicensed operation run by her own cousin. It wasn't a professional opinion. It was a rubber stamp with a familiar last name. I sat with that revelation for a long time. All the official-sounding documents, all the confident dismissals, had been built on nothing. Deborah hadn't just been careless or stubborn. She'd been fabricating credibility for a scheme that had already displaced at least one family before mine. Our attorney filed an emergency motion ahead of the county appeal hearing, introducing the unlicensed contractor findings alongside the nighttime footage. "This changes the entire posture of the case," she told us. "This isn't a disagreement about drainage anymore. This is fraud. Documented." The night before the hearing, couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the Hendersons, about Mrs. Okafor's quiet warnings, about how many other families might have folded under Deborah's pressure without ever finding out the ground she'd stood on was fabricated the whole time. Daniel found me at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., reviewing the case file for the 10th time that week. "You've done everything right," he said, sitting beside me. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you didn't back down when it would have been easier to." I needed to hear that more than I realized. The hearing room was smaller than I expected. Just a handful of folding chairs and a county compliance officer at the front. Deborah arrived in a sharp blazer, flanked by her husband and a lawyer I didn't recognize, projecting confidence that felt, for the first time, slightly forced. She spoke first, calm and rehearsed, insisting the drainage issue was a misunderstanding between neighbors that had spiraled unnecessarily. She mentioned community harmony 3 separate times, a phrase that felt increasingly hollow given everything I now knew about her methods. When it was our attorney's turn, she laid out the timeline methodically. The original violation, the appeal using an unlicensed contractor, the nighttime pipe installation, the photographic and video evidence, and finally, the licensing board's confirmation that Deborah's engineer wasn't licensed at all. I watched Deborah's composure crack, just slightly, at the mention of the licensing records. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered something. She straightened her blazer and said, too quickly, "I was misinformed about my cousin's credentials. That's hardly fraud. That's an honest mistake." The compliance officer, unmoved, noted for the record that honest mistakes didn't typically involve nighttime installation crews and buried evidence. He set a firm remediation deadline and referred the licensing violation to the state contractor board for separate investigation. It wasn't a total victory yet, but it was the first time in 9 months that an outside authority had looked at the evidence and sided unambiguously with us. I left the building lightheaded, gripping Daniel's hand so tightly my fingers ached. Deborah didn't speak to me on the way out, but she didn't need to. The look she gave me across the parking lot said everything. This wasn't over. Not in her mind. If anything, losing publicly seemed to sharpen something dangerous in her. Within a week, a new round of HOA fines arrived, this time citing entirely unrelated violations. An unapproved garden gnome, a trash can left out 4 hours past pickup, a wind chime deemed excessive noise. Petty, obviously retaliatory, but designed to drain our resolve and our wallets simultaneously. Our attorney documented each one, noting the timing relative to the hearing loss. "This is going to help us more than hurt us," she said. "It shows a continued pattern immediately after a legal setback. Judges and boards notice timing like that." Then, one afternoon, Lily's daycare called. A stranger had shown up asking questions about our daily schedule, claiming to be a concerned family friend checking on the Chens. The daycare, thankfully, refused to share information and called us immediately, following protocol. My blood went cold hearing that. We had no idea if it was connected to Deborah, but the timing felt impossible to ignore. Daniel wanted to call the police immediately. Our attorney agreed, advising us to file a report and request the daycare security footage. The daycare's camera captured a woman's silhouette near the entrance. Features unclear but build and posture unsettlingly familiar. I couldn't say for certain it was Deborah, and I told the officer honestly that I wasn't sure. But my instincts screamed otherwise. The police report, filed formally, added another layer to our growing case. Even without conclusive identification, it established a documented escalation pattern that coincided precisely with Deborah's legal losses. Coincidence stopped feeling like a reasonable explanation. I started walking Lily to and from daycare myself after that, keeping her closer, watching every car that slowed near our street. The fear wasn't rational exactly, but it was real, and it changed how safe I felt in a neighborhood I used to love. Mrs. By one evening, unprompted, carrying a casserole and, more importantly, information. Deborah's been asking around about your daughter's school, she said quietly. I told her I didn't know anything. But she's rattled. Maya. Rattled people get reckless. That reckless energy showed itself again days later. Our trail camera caught Deborah, alone, cutting our security camera's power cable near the fence line at nearly midnight. Wire cutters visible clearly in the infrared footage before the feed abruptly went dark. We had a backup camera she didn't know about, hidden inside a decorative birdhouse Daniel had installed weeks earlier as a precaution. Captured her face clearly, illuminated by her own phone flashlight, methodical and unmistakable in her intent to disable our surveillance. I sat in stunned silence watching that footage the next morning, coffee going cold in my hands. This wasn't a woman defending her landscaping choices anymore. This was someone actively sabotaging evidence, trespassing, and escalating towards something far more serious than a fine dispute. We filed a police report for trespassing and criminal tampering with private property within the hour, attaching the birdhouse camera footage as evidence. The responding officer watched it twice, then looked up and said, "This is enough for us to open a formal investigation." Our attorney called that same afternoon, her voice carrying an edge of genuine alarm rather than her usual measured calm. "Maya, I think it's time we consider a restraining order alongside the civil case. This has moved well past property disputes." We filed for the restraining order that week, submitting the birdhouse footage, the daycare incident report, and the trail camera history documenting nearly a year of escalating behavior. A judge granted a temporary order within days, pending a full hearing the following month. Deborah was served the restraining order paperwork by a county deputy, right at her front door, in full view of anyone walking their dog past her house. For the first time since this began, the neighborhood watched something happen to her instead of to us. Whispers finally started shifting direction. Mrs. Two other neighbors had approached her privately, asking if the rumors about Deborah were true, whether they too might have grounds to revisit old fines and disputes they'd quietly paid off years earlier just to avoid conflict. Deborah, cornered publicly for the first time, doubled down instead of retreating. She began telling neighbors that the restraining order was a manipulative legal tactic and that we were orchestrating an elaborate smear to avoid responsibility for our own property's drainage failures. It might have worked once, before the evidence piled up so high. But too many people had now seen the birdhouse footage, shared quietly among trusted neighbors, and heard the county's own violation findings. Her usual charm was finally failing to outrun the facts. Her husband, Richard, appeared at our door one evening, alone, looking exhausted in a way I hadn't seen before. "I don't know everything she's done," he said quietly, "but I know enough to tell you be careful. And keep documenting. Please." It was a strange, unsettling conversation, half warning and half confession. I asked if he wanted to say more. He shook his head, glanced back toward his own house, and left without another word, as if even that small admission had cost him something significant. 2 days later, our attorney received an unexpected email from an anonymous account, forwarding what appeared to be internal HOA financial documents, spreadsheets showing years of landscaping consulting fees paid to Deborah's cousin's unlicensed company, totaling over $60,000 in community funds. We couldn't confirm who sent it, though I suspected Richard, quietly trying to do the right thing without fully breaking from his wife. Our attorney forwarded the documents to a forensic accountant for verification before we did anything else with them. The forensic accountant's initial review was damning. The payments spanned 4 years, coinciding almost exactly with the timeline of drainage improvements at Deborah's house and the departures of at least 2 previous families from the neighborhood, including the Hendersons. "This isn't just fraud against you," our attorney said, studying the numbers. "This is embezzlement from the entire HOA, funneled through a fake contractor, likely to fund her own property improvements at the community's expense." The scope of it left me momentarily speechless. We faced a decision: pursue our personal case quietly and settle, or expose the full financial pattern publicly, knowing it would draw out an ugly, prolonged fight. Daniel didn't hesitate. "If we bury this, she does it to someone else. We have to expose it." I agreed, though fear still gnawed at me. Deborah had already cut our camera wires and possibly approached Lily's daycare. Exposing embezzlement, on top of everything else, felt like poking a cornered animal that had already shown it would bite. Our attorney suggested a careful approach. Request a formal HOA financial audit through proper bylaw channels, citing the anonymous documents as probable cause, rather than accusing Deborah directly and risking a defamation countersuit before we had airtight, independently verified proof. The audit request required signatures from at least 15% of homeowners under our bylaws. I spent an anxious week going door to door with Daniel, explaining carefully, factually, without accusation, why an audit mattered. More neighbors signed than I expected. Mr. Immediately. No hesitation. Mrs. More neighbors with her. Even a few people who'd avoided us at the potluck signed quietly, almost apologetically, admitting they'd sensed something was wrong for years but never had the courage to act on it. We submitted the signatures to the HOA management company, who, bound by the bylaws Deborah herself had once helped write, ironically, had no legal choice but to schedule an independent financial audit within the required 30-day window. Deborah's response was immediate panic disguised as outrage. She sent a mass email to the entire community calling the audit request a coordinated attack by disgruntled homeowners, and insisting she had nothing to hide in language that convinced almost no one who read it carefully. At the next HOA meeting, easily the most attended in years, Deborah tried to control the narrative from the podium. But the room felt different this time, less deferential, more skeptical, murmurs rippling through the crowd every time she dismissed a question too quickly. A younger homeowner I barely knew stood up and asked directly, "Is it true you approved $60,000 in payments to your own cousin's unlicensed company?" The room went completely silent. Deborah's composure, usually flawless, visibly faltered for the first time in public. "That figure is completely fabricated," she said, though her voice had lost its usual steady confidence. "The audit will prove I've done nothing wrong." I watched her scan the crowd, searching for allies, finding fewer friendly faces than she clearly expected. Walking out that night, several neighbors approached me quietly, apologizing for believing the smear flyer, for the cold shoulders at the pool, for not speaking up sooner. It wasn't a total vindication yet, but it felt like the tide had finally, undeniably turned. The independent auditors arrived the following week. Professional and unaffiliated with anyone in the neighborhood, exactly as our bylaws required. Deborah greeted them icily at the community clubhouse, insisting on being present for every document review, which the lead auditor politely but firmly declined. Word spread that Deborah had spent the days before the audit frantically reorganizing HOA storage records, staying at the clubhouse late into the evening. Mrs., whose house overlooked the parking lot, texted me a photo of her car there past midnight, twice. Whatever she was doing, it wasn't enough. Digital records, turned out, existed independently of the paper files she'd been shuffling: bank statements, wire transfers, digital invoices from the cousin's company, all pulling from sources she couldn't quietly rewrite in a weekend. Around this time, our restraining order hearing finally arrived. Deborah's lawyer argued the cut camera wire was a misunderstanding about property boundaries, and the daycare inquiry was coincidental. The judge, reviewing the birdhouse footage personally, did not appear remotely convinced by either explanation. The judge granted a full 1-year restraining order, along with a formal warning that any further contact or property interference would result in criminal charges, not just civil penalties. Deborah left the courtroom pale, her lawyer whispering urgently beside her. That should have been a moment for her to finally retreat, to cut her losses and let the fallout settle quietly. Instead, 3 nights later, our new security camera, the one installed after the birdhouse incident, caught her again, this time at our fence line with a shovel. I woke Daniel immediately, and we watched together, hearts pounding, as the footage showed her digging near our property's water meter, apparently attempting to disconnect or reroute something before dawn, wearing dark clothing clearly meant to avoid detection. We called the police immediately rather than confronting her ourselves, exactly as our attorney had repeatedly advised. Officers arrived within 15 minutes, catching Deborah still on our property, shovel in hand, no reasonable explanation ready for why she was there at 4 a.m. She was arrested that morning for violating the restraining order and criminal trespassing. The sight of her being led to a patrol car in her bathrobe witnessed by at least 4 neighbors walking their dogs early, all of whom later confirmed it happened exactly as described. The arrest spread through the neighborhood group chat faster than any HOA newsletter ever had. By noon, it wasn't a whispered rumor anymore. It was confirmed, documented, undeniable. The woman who'd controlled this community through fear for over a decade had been arrested on our property. Richard didn't come to bail her out immediately. Took nearly 6 hours, during which I sat with Daniel, still shaking slightly from adrenaline, trying to process that this nightmare had escalated to actual handcuffs in our backyard before sunrise. Our attorney called that afternoon, her tone almost gentle. "This is going to matter enormously, Maya. A criminal trespassing arrest, on top of a restraining order violation, on top of a pending fraud investigation. The picture the county now has of her is completely different than a year ago. The State Contractor Licensing Board, notified separately about the unlicensed Cousins Company, opened its own formal investigation the same week, subpoenaing records from every HOA and homeowner Deborah's engineering approvals had touched over the past several years. More families started coming forward once the arrest made local news. A short article, but enough. 2 former Willowbrook residents I'd never met contacted our attorney directly, describing eerily similar patterns of fines, fabricated inspections, and pressure that had pushed them to sell and leave years earlier. The scope of what Deborah had built over a decade came into sharper focus. Not just one flooded backyard, but a pattern of manufactured crises used to control, intimidate, and financially bleed anyone who threatened her authority or noticed her fraud too closely. Deborah, released on bail, retreated from public HOA duties temporarily, according to a terse email sent by the management company. Her seat on the board sat conspicuously empty at the next meeting. The first one in 11 years she hadn't personally run. A temporary board member, appointed hastily, opened the meeting with unusual honesty. "Given recent events, we felt the community deserved transparency," she said, before confirming publicly, for the first time, that the independent audit had uncovered significant financial irregularities, requiring further review. The room erupted in questions the temporary board member couldn't fully answer yet, but the confirmation alone was seismic. 11 years of Deborah's carefully constructed authority had cracked open in the space of a few short weeks, faster than I'd ever imagined possible. I sat in that meeting surrounded by neighbors who'd once avoided my eyes at the pool, now leaning in to ask what I knew, what came next, whether the families she'd pushed out might have any recourse. I didn't have every answer, but for once, people were finally listening. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table again, the same gesture from the Thanksgiving potluck months earlier, but this time it didn't feel like a warning to stay composed. It felt like quiet recognition that we'd actually made it through the hardest part. Our attorney warned us gently not to celebrate too early. "The full audit results and criminal case still need to play out," she said. "But you built the foundation that made all of this possible. Whatever happens next, that's not nothing." I held on to that. January brought a strange, suspended calm, the kind that settles over a neighborhood waiting to see what happens next. Deborah's house sat quiet, blinds drawn most days, her usual manicured lawn starting to show small signs of neglect for the first time since I'd moved in. The full audit report was due to be released at a special HOA meeting in early February, and the anticipation in the neighborhood group chat grew almost unbearable in the weeks leading up to it. I found myself checking my email constantly, bracing for whatever came next. Our attorney received an unofficial preview from a contact at the accounting firm, The numbers were worse than the anonymous documents had suggested. Closer to $90,000 in misappropriated funds once administrative fees and consulting retainers were fully traced. Deborah's own legal team, apparently sensing the direction things were heading, reportedly began exploring a plea arrangement on the criminal trespassing charge, hoping to resolve it quietly before the financial findings became public and complicated things further for her. Richard filed for divorce that same week, papers becoming public record almost immediately. Mrs. Our unofficial neighborhood intelligence network mentioned he'd moved into a rental across town, unwilling to remain associated with whatever was about to unfold. I felt an unexpected pang of something almost like pity, quickly replaced by the memory of a cut camera wire and a shovel at 4 a.m. Whatever sympathy I might have had for Deborah's unraveling life had limits, and she'd crossed every one of them repeatedly. The county's stormwater office, meanwhile, finalized its own separate ruling. Deborah's original landscaping project had never received proper permitting, meaning every drainage modification on her property for the past 4 years had technically been illegal from the very beginning. That finding alone came with mandatory remediation costs projected at over $40,000. Regrading her entire yard back to original county specifications, this time under professional, licensed, and closely monitored supervision, with the bill landing squarely on her, not the HOA. I couldn't help the small, satisfied exhale that escaped me reading that report. After nearly a year of watching water pool in my daughter's sandbox, the person responsible was finally facing consequences measured in real dollars, not just community whispers. Our own home's foundation damage claim moved forward alongside these developments. Our attorney filed formal damages documentation, the structural crack, the flooring replacement, months of stress and disruption, directly against Deborah personally, separate from the HOA's broader financial mess. The insurance adjuster who inspected our foundation confirmed what our structural engineer had already told us months earlier. The damage was consistent with prolonged water saturation, directly traceable to elevation changes on the adjacent property. It wasn't ambiguous. It was documented fact. Preparing for the upcoming special meeting, I spent an evening organizing our entire folder chronologically. Photos, county reports, licensing findings, police reports, the restraining order, all of it laid out on our dining table like pieces of a puzzle finally forming a complete picture. Daniel looked over the timeline with me, quiet for a long moment. A year ago, this was just a wet lawn, he said. Now look at it. I nodded, feeling something between exhaustion and disbelief at how far one woman's arrogance had actually traveled. Lily, older now and less aware of the specifics, had started calling our backyard the dry yard again, a small phrase that meant more to me than she could possibly understand. The county-mandated fixes on Deborah's side had already begun reducing the flooding. Slowly, the night before the special meeting, I barely slept, not from dread this time, but from a nervous, cautious hope I hadn't let myself feel in months. Whatever the audit revealed publicly, our own case against Deborah was already standing on solid, undeniable ground. Mrs. That morning, her voice unusually excited. There's already a line outside the clubhouse, she said. People are bringing their own folders. Maya. Everyone's got something to say. I hadn't realized how many other quiet grievances had been simmering alongside ours. We arrived early, But the clubhouse parking lot was already nearly full. More cars than I'd ever seen at an HOA meeting before. Word had clearly traveled far beyond our immediate circle of neighbors. This had become the neighborhood's most anticipated event in years. Inside, folding chairs had been added in rows I'd never seen used before. The temporary board sat at the front table, visibly nervous, shuffling papers. A hired forensic accountant sat beside them, ready to present findings to what was clearly going to be a packed, tense room. Deborah wasn't present when the meeting started, though her absence felt loud, almost deliberate. I wondered if she'd finally realized there was no version of tonight she could spin favorably. No charm offensive capable of outrunning a professionally documented paper trail. The temporary board president opened the meeting by acknowledging the unusual turnout, then handed the floor directly to the forensic accountant, whose presentation began with a single slide, a bar graph showing 4 years of consulting fees, spiking dramatically around Deborah's own property projects. Gasps rippled through the room as the numbers came into focus. Nearly $90,000 total, cross-referenced against invoices from a company that, the accountant confirmed clearly, had never held a valid contractor's license anywhere in the state. I sat gripping Daniel's hand, watching neighbors around me exchange stunned, furious glances. This wasn't abstract anymore. Wasn't just our personal grievance playing out in isolation. This was community money, pool funds, street repair budgets, quietly diverted for over 4 years. The accountant continued methodically, showing how fines and violation notices had spiked specifically against homeowners who'd questioned drainage issues or attended meetings asking pointed financial questions, a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence any longer. A woman near the front, someone I didn't recognize, stood up abruptly. "She fined my mother $800 2 years ago for a mailbox color," she said, voice shaking with anger. "My mother sold her house rather than fight it. She's gone now. See this." The room went completely silent at that. I felt tears prick my eyes, thinking of the Hendersons, of the family before them, of how many people had quietly absorbed damage from Deborah's schemes without ever getting the chance to be believed, let alone vindicated. The temporary board president, visibly moved, announced that the findings would be formally referred to the district attorney's office for potential embezzlement charges. In addition to the ongoing licensing board investigation and Deborah's already pending criminal trespassing case. As the meeting continued, our attorney was invited to briefly present our own case's timeline, connecting the personal harassment we'd experienced directly to the broader financial pattern the audit had just exposed. The room listened in a way it never had at any previous meeting. When she mentioned the birdhouse camera footage of Deborah cutting our wires, an audible murmur of disgust moved through the crowd. When she mentioned the 4 a.m. arrest at our water meter, someone near the back muttered, just loud enough to hear, "Unbelievable." I hadn't planned to speak, but something pulled me to my feet anyway. "I just want to say, I began." Voice unsteady. "That for a year. I was made to feel crazy for pointing out water in my own backyard. I wasn't crazy." The applause that followed wasn't loud or dramatic, just steady and sustained. Dozens of neighbors nodding along, some wiping their eyes. It was the first time in over a year that I felt fully, unambiguously believed by the community I lived in. Walking out of that meeting, Daniel wrapped his arm around my shoulders. It's not over, he reminded me gently. But it's about to be, in the way that actually matters. I nodded, exhausted but lighter than I'd felt since the very first flood. 2 weeks after the special meeting, the district attorney's office confirmed it was formally opening an embezzlement investigation into Deborah, citing the audit findings as sufficient probable cause. The news broke on the local county blotter site before most of us had even finished our coffee. Deborah, apparently desperate to control a narrative slipping entirely out of her grasp, requested one final HOA meeting to address the community directly. The temporary board, bound by bylaws, had no legal grounds to deny a homeowner's request to speak. However unwelcome, I almost didn't go, watching her perform. But our attorney encouraged us to attend. If she says anything actionable in a recorded public meeting, she said, it only helps our case. And you deserve to see this through. The clubhouse was even more packed than before. Folding chairs lined against every wall. People standing in the back. Deborah arrived alone this time. No Richard. No lawyer beside her. Just her. Walking to the podium in a blazer that suddenly looked too big for her. She started with an apology. Careful and rehearsed. Admitting to poor judgment regarding the unlicensed contractor while insisting the financial discrepancies were misunderstandings, not theft. Nobody in the room appeared to believe a word of the practiced contrition in her voice. Then, unexpectedly, she pivoted to me directly, gesturing toward where I sat with Daniel. Maya's family has painted me as some kind of villain, she said, voice cracking theatrically, when really, I was simply protecting this community the only way I knew how. The room's mood shifted instantly, murmurs of disapproval rippling through the crowd at the obvious deflection. Someone near the front called out, protecting the community by stealing from it? Deborah's composure, the same practice calm she'd worn for a decade, finally shattered completely. You have no idea what I sacrificed for this neighborhood, she snapped, voice rising sharply, all pretense of remorse evaporating in an instant. I built this community's value. I kept property standards high. And this is how I'm repaid, with lawsuits and arrests and lies. The 4 a.m. digging wasn't a lie, Daniel said calmly from his seat, loud enough for the room to hear. The unlicensed cousin wasn't a lie. The $90,000 wasn't a lie. A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Nods and murmured confirmations everywhere. Deborah's eyes locked onto mine across the room. Something raw and unguarded finally breaking through the polish. You have no idea what you've done, she said quietly, almost to herself, before turning and walking briskly out of the clubhouse without finishing her remarks. The temporary board president, visibly rattled, called for a brief recess. I sat frozen for a moment, processing what had just happened, a decade of careful control unraveling in real time, in front of the very community she'd spent years dominating through fear. When the meeting resumed, the board moved to a formal vote, removing Deborah permanently from the HOA board and revoking any remaining authority tied to her position, pending the outcome of the criminal and financial investigations already underway against her. The vote passed almost unanimously, only 2 abstentions from longtime friends of hers who still couldn't quite bring themselves to condemn her outright. 11 years of unquestioned authority ended not with a dramatic gavel, but with a simple raised hands count in a crowded clubhouse. I expected to feel triumphant walking out that night. Instead, I felt mostly hollow, the adrenaline of the confrontation draining into something quieter and more complicated. Relief tangled with the exhaustion of everything it had taken to get here. 3 days later, Deborah's house went up for sale, a sign appearing in her front yard almost overnight. No announcement, no goodbye to the neighbors she'd once ruled so tightly. Richard's name was already off the deed. The divorce apparently finalized faster than expected. I stood at my kitchen window watching the realtor's sign go up, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and unease. Part of me had braced for a bigger, louder ending. Instead, it was arriving quietly, in pieces, the way most real consequences actually do. That quiet didn't last. Our attorney called with news that changed the shape of everything again. The district attorney's office had uncovered evidence during the financial investigation that Deborah had also falsified insurance claims tied to storm damage on her own property. The claims, filed over 3 separate years, described flooding damage on Deborah's own home that investigators now believed had been staged or exaggerated to collect payouts. Payouts funded, ultimately, by the same insurance pool covering every homeowner in Willowbrook, including us. She wasn't just redirecting water to hurt her neighbors, our attorney explained. She was profiting from the damage she caused. Twice, once by devaluing your properties, and once by collecting insurance money for problems she manufactured herself. The scale of the scheme kept expanding. I thought back to the engineered drainage she'd bragged about that very first day at my kitchen table, and realized with a cold clarity that it had never been about protecting her property value at all. It had been a machine, built carefully, to generate money at everyone else's expense. The insurance company, once notified, launched its own fraud investigation and began clawing back prior payouts, adding civil liability on top of the criminal embezzlement case already moving through the DA's office. Deborah was now facing legal exposure from 3 separate directions simultaneously. Deborah's house sat on the market for weeks without an offer, word of the scandal apparently reaching potential buyers through the same neighborhood grapevine that had once spread rumors about me. Karma, I thought, had a strange sense of real estate timing. Then, one stormy night in late March, something happened that even I hadn't anticipated. A severe storm system rolled through, dumping nearly 4 inches of rain in 6 hours. The kind of storm that would normally have flooded our backyard within the first hour. Our yard, thanks to the county-mandated regrading finally completed on Deborah's side, stayed largely dry, water draining properly for what felt like the first time in over a year. I stood at the window watching it happen, almost disbelieving my own eyes. Deborah's property, however, told a very different story. The remediation work on her side had been ordered but not yet fully completed, still tied up in permitting delays related to her ongoing legal troubles and the sale of the house stalling everything. Worse, the illegal drainage extension she'd buried months earlier, never fully removed, just patched over hastily, apparently gave way under the pressure of the storm, sending water rushing back onto her own property instead of ours for the first time. By morning, her backyard, along with the pool cabana she'd built the whole illegal drainage scheme to protect, sat under nearly a foot of standing water. The same kind of flooding she'd forced onto my family for over a year, now finally reaching her own front door. Neighbors gathered cautiously along the street the next day, phones out, watching a cleanup crew wade through Deborah's flooded yard. Nobody said it aloud, not wanting to seem petty, but I caught more than one satisfied glance exchanged between people who'd suffered under her rule. I didn't go over there. Didn't gloat, though I'd be lying if I said some small part of me didn't feel a fierce, complicated satisfaction watching the exact consequence of her own illegal engineering finally, physically, find its way home. Our attorney called that same week with an update. The insurance company, now aware of the flooding at Deborah's own property, was investigating whether she'd already attempted to file another fraudulent storm damage claim, this time on a house she no longer even fully owned. She tried. Our attorney confirmed a few days later, something almost like disbelief in her voice. She filed a claim within 24 hours of the flooding. The adjuster flagged it immediately given the ongoing fraud investigation already attached to her name. That attempted claim became the final piece prosecutors needed. Filing a fraudulent insurance claim while already under active investigation for prior fraudulent claims demonstrated, in the DA's words, a continued pattern of deception unaffected by pending legal consequences. Deborah was formally indicted in April on multiple felony counts: embezzlement of HOA funds, insurance fraud, and a separate charge related to the falsified contractor licensing documents used to mislead the county stormwater office over multiple years. The criminal trespassing case from our backyard, once the loudest headline in this entire saga, now sat almost as a footnote beside the much larger financial crimes stacking up against her. I hadn't expected that particular irony, watching the smallest charge become the least significant one. Local news picked up the story properly this time. A real segment rather than a brief blotter mention, featuring interviews with several affected homeowners, including, eventually, myself. I hesitated before agreeing to appear on camera, unsure I wanted my face attached to this story publicly. Daniel encouraged me gently. You spent a year being told you were imagining things, he said. Let people hear it from you, in your own words. For once, I agreed, and sat for the interview in our now permanently dry backyard. Lily's swing set visible behind me. She made me feel crazy for pointing out water in my own yard. I told the reporter, echoing almost exactly what I'd said at that packed HOA meeting months earlier. I wasn't crazy. Reports, evidence the whole time. She just counted on nobody believing me. The segment aired that weekend, and by Monday, our inbox held messages from homeowners in 2 other North Carolina counties describing eerily similar HOA power struggles, some asking for advice, others simply grateful to see a story where the neighbor finally faced real consequences. Deborah's plea negotiations dragged through the summer, her legal team clearly trying to minimize exposure across 3 separate cases simultaneously. Our attorney kept us updated, though by then, our personal civil case for property damage had already settled favorably, funded partly by her homeowner's insurance. The settlement covered our foundation repairs completely, along with compensation for the flooring damage, the months of stress, and legal fees, more than enough to finally, fully fix everything Deborah's illegal drainage scheme had broken in our home over the past year and a half. I remember signing the settlement paperwork at our attorney's office, feeling less triumphant than simply, finally, tired in a good way, the exhausted relief of setting down something heavy I'd been carrying for so long I'd almost forgotten what it felt like without it. You should be proud, our attorney said, sliding the final documents across her desk. Most people would have paid the first fine and moved on. You didn't just fix your own yard. You exposed something that had been hurting this community for over a decade. In September, Deborah accepted a plea deal rather than risk trial on all counts. She pled guilty to embezzlement and insurance fraud, with the licensing fraud charge folded into sentencing considerations. The trespassing violation from our property was resolved separately as part of the same package. The sentencing hearing was open to the public, and I chose to attend, along with Daniel, Mrs. Okafor, Mr. Alvarez, and, to my surprise, both Hendersons, who'd driven back from 3 hours away specifically to be present when the judge delivered her ruling. Deborah stood at the front of the courtroom. No blazer this time, just a plain gray suit that seemed to swallow whatever confidence she had left. Her voice, when the judge asked if she had anything to say, came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I made choices I deeply regret," she said, reading from a paper her lawyer had clearly prepared. It sounded practiced, the same careful performance she'd given at that final HOA meeting, and I found myself unmoved, watching her rehearse remorse the way she'd once rehearsed authority. The judge, reviewing the full scope of the case, nearly $90,000 embezzled, multiple fraudulent insurance claims, years of documented harassment against multiple families, and a pattern the judge specifically called predatory abuse of a position of community trust, did not appear moved either. She sentenced Deborah to 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation, full restitution to the HOA and the insurance company, and a permanent ban from ever serving on a homeowners association board anywhere in the state of North Carolina again. The restitution order specifically named the Hendersons and the earlier displaced family, both entitled to compensation for losses tied to Deborah's fabricated inspections years before I'd even moved into the neighborhood. Justice, delayed as it was, had finally arrived for more than just my family. Mrs. cried quietly beside her husband as the sentence was read, gripping his hand the way I remembered gripping Daniel's during our own hardest moments. Afterward, in the courthouse hallway, she hugged me tightly, unexpectedly, whispering, "Thank you for not giving up." "I almost did," I admitted honestly. "More than once." She nodded like she understood completely. That's exactly what she counts on. People giving up before the truth catches up to her. You just happen to be the one who didn't. Her words stayed with me for a long time. Deborah was led out of the courtroom through a side door, cameras from the local news outlet catching a brief, blurry glimpse of her being escorted away. The same woman who'd once controlled an entire neighborhood's fines, fears, and Thanksgiving potluck seating arrangements with a single glance. I felt no urge to watch that footage more than once. There was no satisfaction left in cruelty, only in knowing that the truth, however long it had taken, had finally outrun every excuse, every threat, every carefully constructed lie she'd used to stay in control for over a decade. Richard, divorced and largely absent from the proceedings by then, sent a brief, awkward message through our attorney a few weeks later, an apology, of sorts, admitting he'd suspected some of what was happening but hadn't wanted to believe it about the woman he'd married. I didn't respond directly. There wasn't much to say to a man who'd known something was deeply wrong and chosen comfort over confrontation for years. But I understood, in a way, how easy it must have been to look away from something that terrifying and complicated. The HOA board, permanently reformed under new leadership, voted unanimously to implement stricter financial oversight rules, mandatory annual independent audits, and a formal, documented process for handling drainage and property disputes, changes that came directly from lessons learned through our nightmare. Mrs. elected to the new board that fall. The first genuinely transparent HOA leadership Willowbrook had seen in over a decade. She called me personally to share the news. "We're naming the new drainage review policy after your case," she said. "Unofficially, of course." I laughed for what felt like the first time in months. A real laugh. Unguarded. "Just make sure nobody else has to go through what we did to get proper drainage rules," I told her. She promised, and knowing her, I believed she'd hold the board to it. Our own backyard, meanwhile, had fully healed. New sod had taken root over the winter, the foundation crack repaired and reinforced, Lily's swing set standing on solid, dry ground for the first time in what felt like her entire life, even though she was too young to remember the flooding at all. Daniel and I sat on our porch one evening in early October, watching the sunset over a yard that finally, simply, worked the way a yard should. "Feels strange," he said, "that it started with something this small. Water pooling near a fence." I nodded slowly, thinking the same thing. "It was never really about the water," I said eventually. "It was about her needing to control everything around her, and us being the first people willing to prove her wrong." Daniel considered that for a moment, then smiled. "Well, proved her wrong." A few weeks later, a moving truck appeared in front of Deborah's now-vacant house, the sale finally completing under court-ordered oversight tied to her restitution payments. A young couple with a toddler moved in shortly after, entirely unaware of the storm that house had weathered before they arrived. I introduced myself over the fence line one afternoon, welcoming them the way no one had properly welcomed me when I'd first moved in. The wife mentioned, cautiously, that a neighbor had briefly mentioned some HOA drama involving the previous owner, but nothing specific. I kept it simple. Drainage a while back. "It's all resolved now. The county actually rewrote some of the HOA rules because of it." She seemed satisfied with that answer, and honestly, it felt good not to have to relive every detail for a stranger. Mr. Still living 2 houses down, stopped by one Saturday with a small housewarming gift for the new family. A tradition, he told them cheerfully, that Willowbrook had somehow forgotten how to practice for a long time, but was finally remembering again. I watched him chat easily with the new neighbors, laughing about something in the yard, and felt a quiet, unexpected gratitude for how much the entire street had changed since that first flooded morning I'd woken to find our patio furniture sunk in mud. Our attorney called one last time in November, closing out the final administrative details of our case. "You should know," she said. "Restitution payments started arriving on schedule this month. Small, but steady. She's paying it off exactly the way the court ordered." I thanked her for everything, meaning it more than the words probably conveyed. She'd believed us from the very first phone call, back when it was just soggy grass and a confusing HOA notice, long before any of us understood how deep this actually went. That night, I updated the folder one final time, not with a new fine or flood photo, but with a printed copy of the final court order. Restitution schedule attached. and tucked it into a drawer instead of keeping it on the kitchen table where it had lived for over a year. Lily asked, watching me close the drawer, "Is the water lady gone now?" "Mommy?" I knelt down to her level and told her simply, "Yes, sweetheart. She's gone." She nodded, satisfied, and ran off toward her swing set without another thought about it. A year passed, quietly, in the way ordinary life does once a crisis finally ends. Willowbrook's new HOA board sent out newsletters that were, for once, actually boring pool schedules, landscaping tips, nothing weaponized, nothing hidden behind polished threats disguised as community concern. I ran into Mrs. Ng, this time at a farmer's market 2 towns over, entirely by chance. She told me she and her husband had finally stopped flinching every time a certified letter arrived in their new mailbox. A small, hard-won kind of peace. Deborah, from what little I heard through the county's public records, remained in prison. Her case occasionally referenced in local news articles about HOA fraud and homeowner protections. Her name slowly becoming less a person to fear and more a cautionary example other communities studied. I never spoke to her again after that final HOA meeting. Never felt the need to. Whatever closure I required had come not from confronting her personally, but from watching a system, slow and imperfect as it was, finally hold her accountable through evidence rather than intimidation. Our attorney reached out one last time that summer, mentioning she occasionally cited our case, anonymized, when advising other homeowners facing similar HOA power struggles. "You gave a lot of people a roadmap," she said. "Document everything. Trust the process. Slowly." Daniel and I hosted our first real backyard barbecue since everything began, inviting Mrs. Okafor, Mr. Alvarez, and even the new young family living in Deborah's old house. Watching Lily run barefoot across dry, green grass with the neighbor's toddler felt like the quietest kind of victory. Standing at the grill that evening, Daniel caught my eye across the yard and smiled. No fines waiting in the mailbox. No cameras needed anymore. Just an ordinary summer evening in a neighborhood finally. Genuinely, ours again, proof that patience and evidence had outlasted fear. Looking back now, I don't think Deborah ever understood that her downfall wasn't caused by one dramatic confrontation, but by 1,000 small, boring, patient acts of documentation, photographs, timestamps, emails, folders, the unglamorous evidence she'd always assumed no one would bother collecting. She sent her floodwater into my yard expecting me to fold quietly the way others had before me. Instead, I sent it right back, not with a shovel in the dark, but with truth, patience, and a paper trail long enough to finally drown her own carefully built empire of control. Our yard stays dry now, every storm season, and every time it rains, I still glance out the kitchen window, half from old habit, half from quiet satisfaction, watching water do exactly what it should, flowing away, harming no one, the way it always should have. The END.